C. Stephen Evans offers a somewhat unique abductive moral argument for theism in his book, God and Moral Obligation. Evans thinks that it is wrong to argue that moral facts give evidence for theism. However, he maintains that moral obligations do constitute evidence for theism. He writes, "It is not quite right to say that there would be nothing left of morality if God did not exist. However, leaving God out of the picture when it comes to morality puts pressure on us to revise our understanding of morality or even lose faith in morality altogether. In particular, the part of morality termed obligation threatens to drop out of the picture or be transformed beyond recognition." Evans' approach appears to have a promising response to the first challenge which I raised. Because he only takes moral obligations to require an explanation, he can accept that moral truths exist necessarily. While he doesn't explicitly make this argument in his book, his own preferred account of moral obligations sees obligations as arising within a social context. And since such contexts do not exist necessarily, moral obligations will be contingent on this model. This will give us some reason to suppose that they may need an explanation, which will answer my first challenge. By arguing exclusively from moral obligation, Evans also enables himself to get around part of the second challenge which I initially raised for moral arguments, because this move helps him to escape the Euthyphro dilemma. He can claim that God's commands are not capricious or arbitrary because they track moral facts which do not depend upon God's subjective will. As he explains, restricting the account to moral obligations allows the defender of divine command theory to escape the dilemma. Are moral obligations duties because God commands them? The proponent of divine command theory answers yes. However, this does not imply that God's commands are arbitrary. God's commands are aimed at the good, and therefore certainly are not arbitrary. Since Evans' argument is abductive, the third challenge is also not as much of a problem for him as it is for someone like Craig. Still, Evans will need to show that his divine command theory of moral obligations is superior to the alternatives. And to his credit, he attempts to do just that, both by spelling out some advantages of his own theory in Chapter 2, and then by raising some challenges for Wielenberg's account in Chapter 5. This brings us nicely along to my fourth challenge, for it is on this front that I think that Evans' argument flounders. Why is theism a better explanation for moral obligations than the non-theistic alternatives? I will again use Eric Wielenberg's non-theistic account as an alternative against which to compare Evans' theistic account to see if Evans' account has any explanatory advantage. Happily, Evans invites this comparison himself since he directly interacts with Wielenberg in the 5th chapter of his book. He begins by asserting that a Platonic theory of morality is not actually in competition with his own, since one could adopt the Platonic theory for moral facts, and even for some moral obligations, but one could conjoin this with his divine command theory of moral obligations, such that moral Platonism does not exhaust all there is to say about moral obligations. He explains, "It is not a rival view that must be refuted. First of all, as I have repeatedly stressed, a divine command theory presupposes a framework of moral truths as part of its foundation. For example, it presupposes that humans ought to obey any commands a good God might give. There is no reason for the defender of divine command theory to deny that some or all of these moral truths might be necessary truths." So far, so good. Evans is certainly right that a Platonic theory of moral facts need not conflict with a divine command theory of moral obligation, since one could think that God's commands just map onto those Platonic moral facts. Evans is even willing to acknowledge that some moral obligations could themselves be necessary truths, such as the obligation to obey God. But the worry arises that on such an account, it begins to look like God is unnecessary. After all, if some moral obligations can be necessary, then why can't all of them be necessary? And if all are necessary, what need remains for God to explain them? Evans anticipates this objection, but he counters it by insisting that there is a distinction between a fact being necessary and a fact being brute and thus unexplained. He writes, "One might think that there is a conflict between ethical non-naturalism and a divine command theory, because the necessary status of ethical truths implies that they need no such explanation. The person who makes such an objection to divine command theory might see moral facts as simply brute. Eric Wielenberg appears to hold such a view, giving arguments that it is just a brute fact of the universe that some actions are morally right and others are morally wrong. Certainly, it seems to be the case that some necessary truths can be explained by other necessary truths. Take, for example, the proposition that it is false that every prime number is odd. This proposition is necessarily true, but its truth is to be explained by the truth of 2 is both even and prime. So the fact that a proposition is necessarily true does not, by itself, imply that it cannot be explained or does not require explanation. Evans is quite right that necessary truths can, in some instances, be explained by recourse to other necessary truths. But this misses the larger point. The concern is not that moral truths can be necessary, and therefore they cannot be explained. The concern is that if moral truths can be necessary, we need a reason for positing a further explanation for them, since at least some necessary truths are the stopping point of an explanation. In the case of his own example, a further explanation is needed for the necessary truth because this necessary truth is about other necessary truths. But moral truths do not, in general, seem to be about other necessary truths. Once we have stipulated that moral truths are necessary truths, what reason is there to want a further explanation? Evans' answer to this question is that moral obligations are surprising, and this apparently means that they need to be explained. He writes, "Let us assume that humans have moral obligations and that some of their obligations extend towards all other humans, including people that they do not even know and who cannot benefit or harm them. This fact, even if it is true, and even if it is necessarily true, seems surprising. If it is true, then it seems to be the kind of truth that cries out for an explanation." So the basis of Evans insisting upon a further explanation for necessary moral obligations ends up being his intuition that they are surprising and that they seem to cry out for an explanation. One can only imagine how Evans would respond if an atheist insisted that there had to be a further explanation for God's existence because God was surprising and his existence cried out for an explanation. The truth is that sometimes reality is surprising, and we just have to live with that, as even Adam Johnson admits. The fact is that reality is often peculiar. Therefore, Wielenberg's proposal can't be dismissed because many find it odd. A fact being surprising is no reason to suppose that it requires an explanation. Nor is it clear what it means for a fact to cry out for an explanation beyond one having the intuition that a fact needs to be explained. But as I argued earlier, intuitions do not confer justification, so Evans has left us wholly without any non-subjective reason for thinking that necessary moral obligations need to be explained at all, let alone that God is the best explanation of them. It is possible that Evans takes himself to have already argued for moral obligations needing an explanation, for in the second chapter of his book, he reflects upon the nature of obligations and contends that the very nature of obligations suggests that they have personal explanations. He writes, "On a social theory of obligation, these distinctive kinds of claims that persons can make on other persons are all the result of the particular social institutions and relations in which persons participate. Being a parent, for example, is a social role, which is partly constituted by the obligations one takes on by becoming a parent. Hence it is not accidental, but essential, that children have the right to certain things from their parents, and that parents have obligations to provide those things. If God exists and is a genuine person, then the relation between creature and creator is a genuine social relation, and like other such relations, carries with it distinctive obligations. The primary reason for thinking this is the case is simply that viewing moral obligations as divine commands makes more sense of these obligations than any alternative account." So Evans' primary argument for thinking that theism provides the best explanation for moral obligations is an argument based upon an analogy between social obligations and moral obligations. Since social obligations, such as obligations to and from parents with respect to their children, require a social context, so too do moral obligations require an analogous social context which can be met by positing a social relationship between humans and God. Now, on the one hand, one might theorize that moral obligations only begin to exist when human societies begin to exist. This would meet the social context requirement for obligation, but of course at the cost of admitting that moral obligations do not exist necessarily. But more fundamentally, if one could show that moral obligations are relevantly disanalogous to social obligations, then there will be reason to think that moral obligations are not to be explained in the same way as social obligations. Unfortunately for Evans, it is fairly easy to find disanalogies between these two types of obligations. Most strikingly, moral obligations are thought to be categorical. They are thought to hold independently of any conditionals. Even Evans admits as much in Chapter 1, saying, in modern philosophy, terms like should and ought have a special moral sense in which they imply some absolute verdict. But social obligations are not categorical in this way. To take the parent and child example, while children have a social obligation to obey their parents, this obligation is not categorical. There are instances, such as when a parent tells their child to lie to the police, that the child is free to flout that social obligation. Because of this critical difference between moral obligations and social obligations, Evans' analogy is broken, and it becomes doubtful that moral obligations are to be explained in the same way as social obligations. As Michael Huemer argues, someone telling you to do something does not, in general, create a moral obligation to do it. If your next door neighbor tells you to kill your son, this creates no obligation at all, even prima facie, for you to do so. If Satan tells you to avoid eating pork, this creates no obligation to obey. There must be something special about God if his commands are to create moral obligations. What is it? I argue that the divine command theorist has no satisfactory answer to this question. The other worry here is that social obligations are not stance independent. These obligations and expectations are determined by the stances of human societies towards, say, the relationships of parents and children. So the more analogous Evans tries to make moral obligations to social obligations, the harder of a time he is going to have preserving the moral realist commitments of his theory. There is a fundamental dilemma for Evans' argument here. Either he can try to make moral obligations the same as social obligations, or he can try to make them different. If he makes them the same as social obligations, his theory is no longer a moral realist theory. If God's commands are no different than those of a parent or of a government, then they are not stance independent. However, if Evans makes moral obligations different from social obligations, then he loses his argument from analogy that God is the best explanation of moral obligations. Either horn of this dilemma proves fatal to Evans' argument. Consequently, while I think that Evans successfully overcomes the third of my challenges, it's unclear that he can escape the first, and he certainly can't escape the fourth. With respect to the second challenge, he is able to maintain moral realism with respect to moral facts. However, it is less clear that his theory of moral obligation remains compatible with moral realism.